Okay, Becky, welcome so much to Ebb and Glow. If you don't mind just giving us a quick introduction, and then we'll jump into it.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be here. So, since a lot of people can't see me right now as I'm talking, I am a person with dwarfism, meaning as an adult at 36 years old, I stand 4 feet tall. I'm okay with that. I just want the outside world to be okay with that. I am also okay with identifying as part of the disability community. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed 30 years ago, the definition of disability is a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more of life's major activities. And I would say that I have physical obstacles that I face when it comes to being a little person adapting to be in an average height world every day. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think people think there's just this big stigma around the word disability and no one wants to identify with it. But if we get more people to embrace it and understand that it's an asset that can bring beauty and different perspectives to society, there's a lot more that can come from it. And I was born into a family where my parents do not have dwarfism. They're average height and they had no history of dwarfism in the family. They had no knowledge of what it's like to know a person in real life with dwarfism. The only perceptions they had seen were in the media. Little people are historically portrayed as fictional characters, and they didn't know that I could live an independent and fulfilling life until they did as much research as possible, were able to seek out the care that I needed to learn and grow. And a lot of the biggest lessons that my parents learned were treat me like any other child. Let me fall and learn from any mistake that may come my way and any comments that may come my way. The best thing my parents were able to do was give me a sense of humor. I have an older average height sister, and they always joked that my dad wanted two kids, my mom wanted one, so they settled at one and a half. And some people would be like, oh my gosh, that's such a terrible joke. Or like, just how could you say that to her? But it was to prepare me for what could come with the outside world. And what drives my passion is being a voice for the voiceless, advocating for people like my parents did for me before I was able to do it myself.
I love that. I too have a very lighthearted humor personality, especially if there's a situation where there's almost like an elephant in the room. I almost want to point it at Lord to be like, okay, let's just address this to break the awkwardness of the room. So I love that story. Now, growing up with average height parents and a sister, did you ever feel that your parents treat you differently? Because as you mentioned, they've never experienced it before. So did you almost feel like they were a little bit more protective at all?
I think in my early years, it was just kind of in their nature to be protective and make sure that I was being safe, especially when it came to the beginning of the eagerness to be independent, figuring out like if my average height peers were going to hang out in large crowds or go to different events, would it be a safe place for me? And of course, it caused me to have a little resentment of like, why aren't you just letting me go out and do these things? But at the end of the day, I think as an adult myself now, I think about everything that a parent is concerned about is related to wanting their child to be safe. You think back when you're that age, like, why aren't they letting me go do this? But then you think, wait, it all ties back to wanting you to be safe. And I think that's kind of the origin of my early days. But then once I was ready to spread my wings after going to college and then after college, I moved across the country from the East Coast to West Coast. It was kind of out of their control. But there were still moments where I would go out places when I was living in Los Angeles and just in the back of my head, like, would dad approve of this? Am I doing the right thing? Am I going the right places? So it kind of was just always there. But in all honesty, in my observation, just was related to safety versus we don't want you to have your independence.
Even as an 18, 19-year-old going away to university, you're even with a physical disability, you're still 18, 19 years old. So your parents are worried about that. Quite honestly, they're the physical disability is probably out of their mind. They're just like, oh my God, my child is moving all the way across the country. Do you have any early memories growing up where it was kind of the first time that you're like, I'm different, for a lack of a better word? I always get so fascinated by kids. Differences aren't a thing to them. It's just another kid to play with, you know? And even if they recognize differences, kids are almost just fascinated by it. So do you have any early memories where that stands out to you?
Yes, I think a lot of me retelling stories from my childhood are related to being reminded that those were scenarios that happened. And one specifically is when I was playing soccer with my average height peers. I was really bummed out after soccer practice one day, and my dad was picking me up to bring me home. And I told him that I didn't want to be a little person anymore because I wasn't able to run as fast as my friends. And of course, his heart was broken, and he was so nervous about that being the beginning of me continuing to bring that up. But fortunately, he had a beautiful answer that said, I was put on this earth for a reason. I was given difference on a platter. So many people strive their whole lives to be different. And it was enough to get me to be quiet and reflect and take on the next day, the next soccer practice, where it just never came up again. But then in high school, I faced some obstacles when it came to dating. My average height peers were starting to have interest in dating guys, and I was left behind because it just didn't seem like I was the dateable type. And it really took getting involved in the organization Little People of America for me to realize that that was a possibility. And that was several years later. So I went through a stage in my life where it was like, I'm just going to be alone my whole life. I'm not going to find anyone who can accept me for who I am. And so I think I hit a little bit of a rock just trying to think and wrap my head around what the future looked like, especially when I wasn't going to be at home. I was going to go to college and then figure out how to live on my own. And maybe I would always just live on my own. And it was hard to come to terms with that. And then in college, I faced some obstacles just trying to get along with my early roommates the freshman year. One was not aware that I was a little person and was fearful, and it was trying to figure out how do I explain to her that I'm not going to come out and jump at her because that's the perceptions that people have from the fictional portrayals. And it's like that kind of overcompensating to help people feel comfortable so you don't have to feel as uncomfortable as you do in that first moment of interaction. And then when I was applying to jobs, I think a big part of it was my physical appearance and people not really having an experience of being in a room with a little person before meeting me. And that prevented them from giving me the feedback I needed or the productivity of a successful interview that could have happened if they asked me a few questions at the beginning, like, how are you? How can we support you through this process before we dive right into the question? And learn that once I open my mouth, I have people who often tell me because of my short stature, they get really surprised that I can open my mouth and have an intelligent conversation.
Meaning they remind you of how
Yeah.
impressive you are?
Yeah.
That's exhausting, Becky. When I asked my original question about those early memories, you said, I only remember the memories when I was reminded by someone else that there was a difference here. It sounded like you were just always living your life just being Becky.
Yeah. Because even people ask me, like, did you experience bullying growing up? And I think about how my mom worked in the school district where I went to school. She was never my direct teacher, but because she was well respected, people knew that they had to respect me. And she's not the intimidating type. She's 5'1" and just a really friendly person. Like, there was no one out there who was saying, oh, we're going to attack you if you mess with Becky, but luckily we didn't get to that point. And I had a friend who was an ally and in my class from preschool to seventh grade. And my parents strategically set that up just to make sure that I had someone to support me in case there were people making comments. And I really don't remember being bullied during my early years because of having that community and the amount of respect that my family had in the community throughout those years. And of course, there were additional challenges. I had several surgeries throughout my childhood. It's something that comes with being a person with dwarfism. Some people may have surgeries, some may not. But in most cases, people have at least one or two. And I miss school, and it was hard to not be at school every day with my friends. And I think that was the hardest thing for me falling behind because I never wanted to fall behind. And I think even in the workplace, people with disabilities do not want to fall behind. There's a lot of fear around, oh, because they were just diagnosed with an illness, they may have to miss a lot of work. I don't know if we can keep them on. And it's like that fear, that constant fear of falling behind. Even if that person is going to miss a few days, they're going to over deliver before and after.
And it must be hard being someone with a disability. You probably feel that you have to do twice as much work as an average height person or someone without a disability because you almost probably feel like you always have to prove yourself.
Yes. I had a work environment specifically where that happened, where there was someone who everyone in the office just admired, and there was no way that I was going to get to that person's level, no matter how much work I did. And it was exhausting, like having to constantly overcompensate, but still not be able to prove myself enough to get that person's level, the respect that they had for that person. Even if that person was sitting on the computer all day, not being productive, they were still going to get away with it.
You mentioned in previous conversations about the intersectionality, and you're not only battling one battle of diversity and inclusion, you're battling two. You're a person with disability and you're a woman. So talk to me about that, where you got a lot of battles to face. I
and
know
I
one of the
find
battles, and
and
I can barely deal with that.
I find a way to conquer them all. I was actually in New York City several years ago. I was living in New York City and I went to this event. There was an event that happened in Santa Barbara, California, where there was a lot of harassment going on. And there were some tweets that people were sharing on Twitter, women with their feelings about that harassment experience. And this event was specifically around just reading those tweets and really bringing to life how women feel sometimes when they're being harassed. It doesn't make the situation right, but it kind of brought to life those emotions. So I was probably like 32 years old. One of the first moments where I really reflected, wait a minute. When people are making comments about me on the street, especially when I was living in New York City, every day I was coming across thousands of people. So that it was likely that a few people would make comments. It's not just because I have dwarfism, it's also because I'm a woman. And if you try to compare that to a man who has dwarfism, the comments are different. And there's a different level of like, I got you, bro, versus I'm going to tear you apart or I'm going to make you feel vulnerable and violated because I can. And some of the comments that would come after that, it made me think, right, I need to dissect this. Is it because I'm a woman or is it because I'm a person with dwarfism? And I guess up until that point, I didn't really use those two identities as much as I did in that very moment. And then there was another moment that happened that same night. There was someone who told me that she and her cousin were moving from Israel to the States. And she was trying really hard to avoid her cousin because they were both trying to transition into this new high school. And she just wanted to have her own experience. Her cousin was really upset by it because they were really close when they were living in Israel. And after she was sharing that story, she told me, I know this was a challenging time for me, but it wasn't as challenging as what you've gone through in your life. And I tried to get her to stop in her tracks. And I said, a challenge is a challenge. No matter who you are equipped to face with challenges in different ways. I don't want anyone to feel less than because of all the challenges that I've had to face in my life. As a person with a disability, I'm just trying hard to participate in a meaningful way, in an equal way in society. And I don't want people to try to put us on a pedestal because of all that we've dealt with up until this point. And it was trying to bring just a humanity piece to the conversation. And I think that goes with any demographic. We all have something to bring to society. And I think being a woman and a person with dwarfism gives me a different perspective than maybe a male with dwarfism. But there are additional complications and challenges that they may face. And at the end of the day, challenge is the same word.
That example is fascinating. Do you find that you deal with that a lot, where people almost are afraid to complain or talk about their troubles around you? And do you always get a sense that people are walking on eggshells around you?
Everyday life. And then there are those people who come forward and tell me that they have an invisible disability. but they don't want to tell more people than just me because they're afraid of how society will treat them based on their observation of how they see people like me treated in society.
And that's against everything that you are passionate about and speak about. Because what you're all about is how about we bring light to all of our differences because it's actually going to benefit us both in the workplace and our personal relationships. But society is not ready for that, Becky. And do you have any comments or thoughts on why we're not ready? Why are we so awkward and why are we always so overcompensating to not point out the differences?
I think it's fear. It's fear of offending, but you're actually being more offensive by not asking the questions that you need to ask in order to lead to a better understanding that who's in front of you is just another human being wanting to be a part of society without any extra assistance or burden. That you're assuming that if you welcome yourself into their life, that it's going to be a burden for you to then take care of them and explain to other people why they're a good human being. I noticed that a lot during those early years in high school. I had friends, and some of them are my closest friends now happen to be guys. And other people were more worried about how others would feel about them being friends with me or potentially dating me. And it was that fear of what would other people think if I stepped into this territory.
Yeah, that's a tough situation. Especially it doesn't matter what kind of disability you have or if you have any. At the end of the day, people just want to be seen for who they are. So the fact that you have to battle through all these layers first, and then you're like, oh right, like now I'm gonna show you who Becky is. Becky, I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the workplace. I'm such a business person, so this is where I'm going to get really excited and intrigued.
Yes.
Majority of your career has been in the entertainment industry so far, and I did my research. You have a very stacked resume. It's very impressive. And one of your early jobs was you were a talent scout for shows like 90210, Criminal Minds, CSI, The Good Wife. Truly some of my favorite shows. You mentioned also that during your time in the entertainment industry is really when you started becoming passionate about influencing change in the workplace. Being who you were probably expected to cast within these shows, did that have anything to do with it?
So in those shows, in the role that I was in, we were responsible in the casting department to oversee every single speaking role on every CBS show. And I came with the open perspective and passion for disability inclusion and getting more people with disabilities in those roles. And I tried very hard to suggest talented with people with disabilities to be considered for roles, but I still don't think they were ready. The writers were writing the basic descriptions. It could be a doctor, and the casting folks' mindset was a white person who shows up and acts as a doctor without a disability. Still, the statistics now, several years later, I did this job only for a year, 2011 to 2012, but we still see, even though there has been progress since I've been in that work specifically, I've had passions around that work, but 3% of roles in Hollywood represent disability. So it's a disabled character, but 85% of the 3% are not portrayed by people with actual disabilities. So that's like really small percentage. So it'd be 15% of the 3%.
So what you're saying, yeah, so 85% of the 3% is really an able-bodied person acting as a disabled body.
Yes. And you see people win Oscars for those storylines. And sometimes the storylines even tell the disability story in a depressing way. There have been films where there's a person who does not use a wheelchair in everyday life playing a wheelchair user, and then they're suicidal. I'm not saying that every single person who uses a wheelchair does not think about that path, but I'm also saying that there are a lot of people who don't think about that and don't want to be portrayed in that way. And I think it is frustrating because the industry continues to be focused on casting roles just because of a certain description without challenging the writers and directors. Have you thought about this, that, or the other thing? I know all this great talent as a casting director, let me show you who would be great for this role. And I was trying to encourage that. And I got frustrated because of the pushback. And I wasn't in an authoritative position. I was an assistant, but I was still very frustrated that the out of the box ideas weren't being accepted, even though in everyday life, there are people with disabilities. They can also play any type of character in everyday life being portrayed.
Influencing change in a workplace is hard enough, let alone influencing change when it's actually a societal change that needs to happen. You're working on a lot of big shows and big movies. If anything is going to change people's perception, it's going to be through a big film production. You mentioned that you weren't in an authoritative position. You're an assistant. It's gonna go on deaf ears, whatever you say. If someone that you know is in a position where they're trying to implement change and they're maybe not the C-suite executive, when you look back at the steps that you took to try to implement that change, is there anything that you would have done differently to get your ideas heard a little bit more?
I would say speak to the community that you're trying to tell the story about. We always say nothing about us without us. If there is a role around someone with dwarfism, make sure you go to organizations like Little People of America to make sure that description of that role is accurate. And don't always just think of, oh, it's a name actor, it's going to get us box office numbers. That name actor at one point wasn't a name actor, and you never know who could be that next name actor if you give them a chance. And I think it's that lack of training and support that sets people with disabilities up for failure in that industry specifically.
Hollywood entertainment is getting a lot of flack this past year over diversity across the board, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's disability. Do you think there's any shows or movies, maybe specifically to dwarfism disability? Do you think there's any shows or movies that are nailing it? Like they're doing well, they're doing a good job?
Well, I think Peter Dinklage has historically been a great example for the dwarfism community. He's a talented actor and he's known for being a talented actor. Some of the roles that he's in are dwarfism, but sometimes they aren't. And that's the beauty about his career and what he's been able to accomplish and the support he's had along the way. Back in, I think it was 2014, maybe, there were two movies, the Snow White story that came out, Snow White and the Huntsman and Mirror Mirror. One was Universal Pictures and one was Disney. The Disney film Mirror Mirror had people with dwarfism as the seven dwarves. The Snow White and the Huntsman film had name actors who were computer animated. They shrunk them down to make them look like little people. The struggle with something like that, I know they're thinking, oh, we'll get box office numbers because they're name actors, but they're now acting as, even though Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a fictional story, they're now acting based on how they think they should act as the seven dwarfs, regardless of following the script. Of course, some of their preconceived notions and things that they've seen in the past influence how they play that role. And then it impacts how we're treated in society because every single portrayal of dwarfism, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, affects how we're treated because someone is going to see us right after they've seen one of those films and they may act fearful if it's a negative portrayal or excited if it's a positive portrayal, but the excited may also be an inauthentic excited. And it has a lot of complications because then that person could also be going to the delivery room and delivering a child with dwarfism. And because they saw so many negative portrayals, they may be uncertain about how they want to raise their child. And it just is a spiral effect. And I think it's important to have more examples like Peter Dinklage, who can be known for being a talented actor. And you can take his work and enjoy it and then put it aside as you're going through everyday life. Like nobody is like, oh, I saw Peter Dinklage and now I'm going to treat you like a terrible person because he likes being treated like a terrible person. But there are those people who take on those roles that are degrading, like the Wolf of Wall Street film. It encouraged events around the topic of dwarf tossing to happen across the United States And I know that the movie directly influenced that because people were using the movie poster as a promotional poster for their event. And one of the things about that film is I refuse to see it, but I've heard the the cycle of events in the film. They have a moment where they toss someone across the room who has dwarfism, and that person who took that role said, "You know what? Someone was still going to take it if I didn't take it." And they made money and they went on with their life. But even after that scene, there's another scene in the film that talks about how it's a source of income for people with dwarfism and that it's not degrading. And that's worse than actually the act of tossing the person across the room.
It's condoning it.
Yes. And then Peter Dinklage, actually, when he was receiving an award, I believe it was the Emmy Awards, he mentioned something about this guy, Martin Henderson, who has since passed away. But he was tossed in a bar in the UK and got serious brain damage. And ultimately, it led to him passing away. And people don't realize, like, it's an inhumane act that causes people to live a life a lot differently, even if they think that they're going to get attention for that lovely moment that can go by really fast, and then they spend the rest of their lives injured or don't make it.
And the person who did that, there's some deep rooted hatred and discrimination there too, for someone that wants to do that. When you see it in media or entertainment, you feel that it's okay. If someone with dwarfism is portrayed in this one way all the time, yes, I see what the person is saying, where it's like, well, someone was going to take the role, but who needs to stand up and who needs to say something where that's not a role or that's not a scene in the movie? There's one part where there's humor in the movie, and there's another part where you just take it a little too far.
Right. And I think it needs to be when we get to a moment where there are other roles that people can play. And if those are the only roles that people are being offered and they want to pursue a career in this industry, they're going to think that accepting that role will lead to something bigger, even though in most cases it won't. It'll be a one-time gig, but they're thinking that that can be their moment of fame. And why not? But there are a few people, including Peter Dinklage, who, even though it's tempting to take on any well-paying job, they put their foot down to say, I'm not going to do this. And we continue to need more people to do that. My friend who was an actor, he told me a great story about someone who he knew who was a talented actor who went in for a role that was described as a wheelchair user. And that person, the actor who was ready to be hired for the role, challenged the casting directors and said, how many people with this actual description of wheelchair user have you brought into this audition room? And he challenged them to go bring as many people as possible. He ended up still being the right person for the job, but it was taking that extra step to make sure that you check the boxes and saw as many people as possible who live that authentic lifestyle that you're describing. And I think at the end of the day, same with jobs. Jobs and auditions are the same thing. You're interviewing or you're auditioning. It's the right person for the role, but you need to do your research to make sure you give as many people who are qualified the opportunity to audition or interview before making that quick decision to hire someone.
In your experience working in that role or working in any of your roles, who is it in the organization that needs to put a foot down or come forward with an idea that's actually going to implement the change? I like what you said with people receiving the roles almost have to stand up and be like, no more. But there's also someone in a C-suite room who has to stand up. And why aren't they, in your opinion?
It has to come from the CEO, the head of a company, head of a corporation. I heard this story about the late Rick Finkelstein, who was a wheelchair user, and he was the chief operating officer of Universal Pictures for many years. And he would just kind of hide behind his desk and didn't embrace his disability. And it was unknown that there was someone at such a high level who had a physical disability. And that affected how the rest of the company operated because they weren't influenced by his perspective and contribution to the organization because he didn't want them to, but that put them backwards. And I think it's really important. I always use the example of corporations like Microsoft, where Satya Nadella, the CEO, openly talks about his children with disabilities. And now accessibility and disability inclusion is embedded in every part of their organization. It's not just the diversity and inclusion department, the HR department. Every single department of that organization has a disability inclusion component. And that's where we need to go. We need to be at a place where recruiters and casting directors aren't assuming that that's what the decision makers want. They need to know that there are makers out there that you can turn the other way because they may have a child with a disability at home. They're just not ready to share that story, but it may be a moment that could influence them to share that story if you bring someone with a disability in and give them a chance.
You mentioned that when you were graduating from university and applying for that first job, you put 1,000 applications in. You did up to 100 interviews. And out of all of that, you got 3 temporary jobs. That's a lot of applications. Talk to me about some of your experiences because that's obviously you're doing way more because you probably were getting discriminated against. At what point of the process of applying for jobs do you feel like you were getting discriminated against?
I think it was that people were afraid to tell me that they were uncomfortable with me being in the room, or they didn't know a thing about dwarfism, were surprised when I opened my mouth, but still were so much in shock when I entered the room, they weren't going to change their mind. So I knew in many cases that when I walked in the room, I wasn't getting the job, and it made it for a very uncomfortable interview. What I would have preferred is if people told me, you're just a terrible interviewer and you're not getting this job because you don't know how to deliver an interview.
But you knew
Yeah.
you were delivering a good interview. That's the trouble. Like you're well spoken, you're an impressive person, so you know it's nothing to do with that.
But I was willing to get any feedback someone would be willing to give me. I got
But they're almost afraid.
because I would always write a thank you note. So I would get a few, oh, we're just hiring internally, or we're going in a different direction, or like this, that, or the other thing. I truly believe I was qualified to do every single one of those 100 interviews that I got. And I never applied to like a CEO position. These were true entry level
You
jobs.
should have been.
I should have. What was I thinking? I was actually really impressed because with my first temporary assignment, it was at the Hallmark Channel for a month. It was filling in for the chief marketing officer. And I was like, whoa, this is a big deal. But they were on paternity leave. So it was pretty much just being an extra body in the department. But I thought it was like, oh, this is cool. I'm like filling in for this person who's in a high level role. But it ended up being gifting and supporting the department. And it was still a good experience. But it was strictly a month assignment, and I enjoyed just having a place to go for a month for work. I did not disclose that I was a person with dwarfism on my resume, so looking back, I probably would have done that to cut down on some of the
Why
offers.
though? I don't write on my resume that I'm blonde haired, green eyed.
Right? I know. I'm just thinking like when I have some precious time back, if I went back in time and did, but I don't know.
I don't think you would be doing what you're doing now if you didn't go through that experience though, you know?
True. It's
Like
true.
imagine if you were handed this perfect job right away, right at university. You would not be doing the type of work that you're doing today.
And that also brings up a good point that after I had left Los Angeles, after being there for 6.5 years, I felt like I was taking a step backwards and I moved back home to Boston. I actually lived with my parents for a year and a half and definitely like hit some hard moments because I was thinking about how I had been so independent living out in Los Angeles on my own. And now I'm living at home with my parents, an adult with a disability living at home with their parents. I know, especially during these times, a lot more people are going through that experience, but I was being hard on myself, saying, like, what do I do next? And I left Los Angeles working in that casting job as an assistant. And as I was thinking about pursuing a career in speaking or at least starting to tell my story, I was also hard on myself thinking, like, who wants to hear my story? I was only an assistant in Hollywood. And then I started telling it and people were interested. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to keep practicing and figure out where I can go from here. And from that point forward, I was able to be very transparent about the fact that speaking is a passion of mine, even if it is something that I do in addition to a job that pays the bills. Full transparency, even with speaking for the past 8 years, I haven't made enough that I could have an income off of, even a year's income. But it's such a passion that I'm willing to do as much as I can to practice and get my story out there with the hopes of helping others who come after me. And from that point forward, I was able to be my true authentic self because people knew if they were going to hire me, that that would be an aspect of what I would always do on the side if I got the request to go do that. And I didn't have to hide it anymore. Every job after my first job was through networking, and I was able to meet people who knew me who could then give me a chance rather than having surprise factor. I would say the surprise factor still happened a little bit when it came to thinking about promotions. I really didn't get that support from higher levels in previous jobs that I've had. I'm fortunate in the position I'm in now at an organization that helps with disability inclusion. I have experienced at least one promotion, but I think we often celebrate new hires with disabilities, but we don't celebrate enough the retention and advancement and helping people get up the ladder. And the more people we have up the ladder with disabilities, the more change can happen down the ladder.
Do you find with HR now is diversity and inclusion as a checkbox? I swear, Becky, I remember in my first job, I was just friends with kind of the HR group, and they had KPIs on how many women they hired, how many people with disability they hired. It was a KPI. That's so ridiculous. But you make a good point. They haven't had a KPI on promotions or growth or advancement with someone with disabilities. I heard this phrase early on in my university career where what gets measured gets done, and it
Yes.
applies to everything. You got to change people's KPIs if you want change within your organization.
And more specifically, the index that I manage, it's called the Disability Quality Index that currently US companies take on behalf of their 500 or more employees. And some of the questions are related to the key performance measures, seeing if senior executives are held accountable for disability inclusion. And there are hiring goals and other aspects. And through the tool and the research that we've done, we did a partnership with Accenture. We were able to find out that companies who do well when it comes to disability inclusion also do well financially.
You get someone in the C-suite level of attention then, don't you?
Yes. And
But it
it
links
really
to the bottom
it,
line.
it's been a trickle effect and it's amazing. And I think it's important for people to think of the whole diversity conversation at the same time. I often find, especially when I was working in the entertainment industry, a lot of different guilds have a women's committee and they say that women and people of color are their first priorities, and then they'll eventually get to LGBT and disability. But you got to do it all at the same time because it takes a lot of the same strategy and effort. And you don't want to say that you have an inclusion effort that doesn't include certain groups.
Absolutely. Do you feel that people with disabilities and people of color and women and the LGBTQ, do you feel that once that checkbox is ticked within the organization, do you feel that individual deals with a lot of tokenism?
It would depend on the size of the organization, but that's exactly opposite of what we want the goal to be. We also ask in the index, like if companies have retention and advancement programs that are focused on people with disabilities, but the end goal would be for women with disabilities to be considered for a women's leadership program, or people of color, someone with a disability who also happens to be a person of color, be part of that program. If we continue to have the conversation outside of where we're putting people, we're going backwards. And I think the same thing happens in the school environments. There's the special education classes, and they have this different room off to the side. And then there's the rest of the school that has their traditional path that they go on. But if you're not integrating people with disabilities at an early age into the school systems and into the workplace, they're going to continue to be behind.
And it's going to continue to be segregated too.
Yes. And then what happens if some of those people in the workplace then welcome someone into their family who has that similar disability? It's going to influence how they raise their children and what they think's possible for them.
There's going to be a lot of fear and scarcity and limitation to it for sure. With your experience with all of these big corporations, trying to consult with them on disability inclusion, I'm curious some of your experiences and probably some ignorant responses and questions and cringy moments working with organizations, hey? It must make you laugh sometimes.
Absolutely. So the disability and media piece that came about while I was working at the talent agency, which was my first job. On my fifth year working at the talent agency, I was finally asked, "What is it you're passionate about?" Because when I started my career, especially after trying to get my foot in the door in the first place, I didn't express what I was passionate about and why I wanted to work in that industry because I needed to gain credibility as a hard worker in the respect of other people around me before I started sounding like I had my own agenda. Then when people started asking me what I was passionate about, I got the support to host a panel discussion of the agency, which was a big deal because this was a big talent agency and they had a 180 seat theater that I filled for a panel discussion, people with disabilities in front of and behind the camera sharing their stories. And from that conversation, I built a social platform, just Facebook and Twitter, where I share stories of people with disabilities in everyday life doing things that people may think are impossible. But it's trying to help more people see people like them represented because I don't think that film and TV does a good enough job yet. So there need to be other platforms where these stories are shared. And then Disability In is an organization that I work for. We really want to embrace and strengthen the word disability. And then in can mean a lot of things. Disability International, Disability Index that I manage. We have a program, Inclusion Works, which is a consulting arm, and it's working with corporations to help them erase the fear when it comes to hiring and including people with disabilities in a meaningful way in their workforce. And I think the biggest barriers that we face is those organizations that we talk to who say, we've got people of color, women, LGBT inclusion down pat, but we don't even know where to start when it comes to disability. And we offer to help guide them and start them on that journey, but they're so fearful of saying the wrong thing, which prevents them from doing the work.
I mean, you look at a lot of organizations that were dealing with Black Lives Matter, they had a hard enough problem putting a statement out, worried about saying the wrong thing. And it's like, just get the statement out. The more you prolong it, the worse it's going to be.
Right. And it takes probably having a senior executive who finds a passion for the work. And what is also challenging is when I'm working with companies on the index, people who are in the role of being the responsible person for filling out the tool may have a driven passion from some way. Maybe they have a disability themselves or they're a strong ally. And then they may switch roles or go to another company. Maybe I have them as a new contact when they're at that new company, but I've now lost a passionate person at the company where they used to be. And maybe that new person they hire wants to focus more on people of color, LGBT issues, or women, depending on how they identify. And then that company as a whole goes backwards.
It's interesting that they pick one, so they pick just the people of color, just the disability, just the women. Why don't they see it as an overall organization?
I think at the end of the day, just with this work specifically, people just worry about it taking extra time in their day and it's not part of their everyday job to focus on this. And it shouldn't be seen as that. But it really starts from the top. So if the chief diversity officer has that vision of what you're talking about, it will become a priority regardless of who comes into that new role. And in most cases, the role's not described as like a disability inclusion manager. Sometimes it is, but it's usually just a diversity and inclusion person. So they kind of take their own identity and bring it to the role and express what they're passionate about. But we need more people to be like how I was when I first started. Like, you just got to do the work and build that credibility. And even if it's hard to do things that you're not comfortable doing, give it a try. And you'll probably find that you enjoy it more than you originally thought you would.
Yeah, it's a good point. What's your experience with everyone else within the little people community? Is everyone as driven and passionate about this as you are? You're really leading the torch here, aren't you?
When I started speaking, it was actually around the time that I built the disability and media brand. And my best friend, she told me about how she had started a blog and a Twitter page. And I thought, I was kind of going through a rough time. And I thought, you know what? I should probably start that. And I did that before I started speaking. And I really think it's important to build your brand and get yourself out there. A lot of people are trying to come to me now and say, how do I get speaking or how do I book speeches? And it's not just like trying to focus on that. You got to build your brand in order for people to come and find you and want to hear your story. And so I think more people don't realize that there is a platform that already exists out there on the internet, and you should just continue to share your unique story. I would love if there were thousands of other little people who have the same interest and could help me with this. And there are a few who I've become very close with, and we try to work on collaborative efforts together. I was on a panel with someone earlier today, but I think it's some people are just sick and tired of being laughed at and having comments come after them. And there's also a divide between those people in the dwarfism community who identify as being part of the disability community and those who do not want to identify as being part of the disability community. And then there are people who may have additional limitations like physical, or maybe they're blind or low vision or hard of hearing. But I would say it's hard. It's just, it really, I think, depends on how you're raised and the environment you're raised in.
I was just going to say that just hearing the stories of your parents, did they go through all of these parenting classes before? They just seem so
Observation.
equipped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Did
think
they have their own support community at all of other parents?
they actually became support for new parents of
That's good.
them in the community after I was born. They are quick to say that they just figured it out. They looked for support through medical doctors that we had in the local community. And then we had some mentors in the doctors that we were able to find further away. There was a doctor in Baltimore, Maryland, who definitely taught them a lot. And I think they kind of learned as they went. But the biggest thing was just believe in me and push me to work harder and keep up with society. And I think that was the best thing. And I think just even with the advocacy work and sharing your story, it's a very vulnerable situation to be in, like sharing your entire story and being open to questions that people want to ask. And I think maybe some people just would be closed up when it comes to answering certain questions. And maybe that's not why they have the desire to do this work. But there are certainly people who are in everyday careers. We're still trying to find out who does what. There are 8,000 people who are members of the Little People of America organization, but the annual conventions, usually there are about 3,000 people who show up. But of the 8,000 and of the 3,000, it also includes average height family members. So we're still getting at a very small percentage of people with dwarfism who are actively engaged in the organization. And then that leaves us to think, where are the other 25,000 people who have dwarfism who live in the United States? And I think there are so many people who either hide from society or don't embrace having dwarfism and don't want to associate and be part of the organization. But really, the only way we can figure out how to do better work is to keep track of higher numbers and find more people to be examples.
What would you say to not only people with dwarfism, but people with disabilities that are shying away from coming forward and sharing their stories and experiences? What would you say to them?
I would say for me, even as I'm doing this work, it's more challenging for me to speak to the choir, to people with disabilities. And
You need someone to share this responsibility with you.
right. And that it's easier for me to speak to a community that thinks they don't need the education about people with disabilities. I would say there are so many moments when I'm so surprised that different parts of my story influence people in different ways with or without disabilities. So there could be a part of your story that you're hiding that could help so many people.
And it's interesting that you said you'll probably help people without disabilities. Because you mentioned at the beginning of our call, a challenge is still a challenge. And that's what I love about sharing stories similar to your own. Is a lot of my audience is going to take a lot back with them and without living the similar life that you have, you know? Even when we talked about when you want to put forward an idea in the workplace, a challenge in itself. And it doesn't matter if you could be a white male and still have a lot of challenges getting an idea pushed forward. It's nothing to do with your disability sometimes.
Right.
How do those people become not only an ally for someone that's being discriminated against, but what do we have to do in the workforce to make society better as a whole in terms of diversity and inclusion?
I was also asked this question earlier, and my response was that you matter too. Even if you don't have a disability, it's important for us to have meaningful conversations in order to think about the best approach moving forward when it comes to creating an ally relationship. It's important for you to not assume that however way that you're observing something that you don't think is right is not how someone with a disability would want it. I think the best example of that is if you're in a store and you see someone with a disability trying to reach something, don't go to try to do it for them. Offer to help them and let them decide if they need the help. So, same thing with when it comes to being an ally, seek out the community that you're trying to be an ally for and have meaningful conversation. So you do it in the most intentional way possible. So you're not helping us go backwards versus forward.
That's good advice. People that you want to help and stand up for, just go ask them what they want help with, you know? And Becky, it sounds so simple when I say that out loud, but I don't think it's that simple to anyone. And still, talk to me tomorrow and I'll still probably stumble over my words and
Yeah.
be afraid that I'm going to offend people.
Yeah. And the other thing is don't be hard on yourself for mistakes you've made in the past. If you've seen someone like me in the past and you didn't handle it in the best way possible, I'm here to help you move forward. I don't want you to spend so much time dwelling on the past. If you want to share me at any point, if you were to reach out, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you about how it was handled, but I'm not going to shun you. I'm here to support you moving forward. And if I see you making the same mistake in the future, maybe we'll have another conversation. But it's really about helping you do better in the future versus getting so bummed out about how you handled it in the past.
That's a good point. A lot of your career has also been in marketing and social media. Do you see any brand that within their marketing, they're doing a good job of diversity and inclusion? And they feel free to name drop some brands that are awful.
I think it's important if you're going to portray a disability story, make sure you authentically use people with disabilities in your content. And then, even when it comes to branding and marketing your products, a lot of corporations have employee resource groups that are cross disability and cross organizational functions that they serve in. And they're the best people to survey to make sure that a product's being marketed in the right way to all different parts of the disability community and that the brand really speaks to them in the way that it's being marketed. And it's important to seek out people from all different disability groups to make sure you tell that story in the most authentic way possible. And then you'll attract consumers with disabilities and potential hires.
But what would you recommend to, say, a startup company that maybe they don't have it within the plan to have an employee in their office with diversity and inclusion? They don't have it in a plan to have one marketing person focused on making sure our marketing efforts are diverse. Are there agencies that will help them specifically with this?
I would think one of the steps you could do is reach out to the nonprofit organizations that represent whichever disability you're trying to portray. They could give you quick consultations on those types of things. And within the entertainment industry specifically, there's a talent agency called KMR, and they represent a lot of actors with disabilities if you're looking to seek out actors with disabilities specifically. And they can also give you guidance on how to tell the story in the best way possible.
I'm going to add those resources in the show notes because within my network, a lot of us are business people working for startup organizations and we want to make these changes, but sometimes our hands are tied whether our CEO is not just going to hire someone internally just to focus on this. Yes. But if we can show that there is a benefit to hiring an agency or hiring a nonprofit, so sometimes it might not be clear to a lot of people who those organizations are. So I'll find some out of the show notes.
Absolutely. I'm happy to provide those resources. We want everyone to have access to the resources they need.
Absolutely. Now, one of my last questions for you is within the research that I did on you, you mentioned that in the past 8 years, You've spoke at over 200 venues speaking on diversity and inclusion. And you spoke to schools, other nonprofit organizations, corporations. You've been to Africa, right? That's roughly 2 engagements every month. That's a lot. You need to just start sending them recording me. Like, this is my damn speech. Like, I know everything you're going to ask. Here's the FAQ. Here's all my answers. But what I was going to ask is, out of all of those conversations you've had, is there a question that no one or rarely you get asked that you want someone to ask you?
The best question was at a school where someone asked me if my hair and teeth grow the same or if I've ever been attacked by a large dog. And I think I just love the fact that there were no boundaries with those types of questions because I'm not used to answering those. And even when I was answering, I thought, okay, I think so. Yes, I've been in an environment where there's a large dog, but then yes, I think my hair and teeth grow the same. But it was just that like awkward curiosity.
Could you feel the silence in the room of the awkwardness?
The teachers, they freak out the most.
They were so embarrassed.
Oh gosh, we're so sorry. And my response was, I put it out there. Ask me whatever question you want. Because I've always craved it and I continue to crave it in every moment of my career. Everyone really enjoys hearing me speak, but I'd love to continue to get more feedback just from people just in general. And I think it kind of just stops at, oh, that was an amazing speech. And I would love to just get more lessons from other people who've seen me and can support me, especially as I figure out those next chapters of my speaking career and writing a book and all of the other things to come.
You always want to be matched up with a coach that can coach you just directly on speaking and promoting books and get you connected to a PR agency that can make all that process easy. Becky, this world is small. Like, who knows who will listen to this and be like, Becky is exactly who I was looking for.
It's amazing to just be in any type of environment and continue to practice. Never know who it'll influence or what life experience someone had the moment before they come hear me speak. And I just strive to continue to just be a resource and be there for people and try to help them navigate whatever it is they may be going through in their life. Just through sharing my story. I'm not a counselor in any way, and I try to be supportive of people, but I also want to set boundaries of how much I can.
With all that being said, to close it out, do you feel like there's anything left unsaid or anything that you really want to hit home?
I just want to say, take a chance. Give someone like me a chance to participate in your community, in your organization, support them, allow them to grow, offer to be a mentor, and provide constructive feedback, and just continue to keep an open mind and don't be fearful of saying the wrong thing because you can work it out together once you get to know a person by their name and build a relationship from there.
And then lastly, Becky, where do we find you?
You can go to beckymotivates.com. You can always email me, ask me any questions, send me any comments at beckymotivates@gmail.com. And then I have YouTube/Becky Motivates, Pinterest. You can see past speeches there, both Pinterest and YouTube, Twitter, Becky Motivates, Instagram, Becky Motivates.
Well, Becky, the one thing I will say to our audience is Becky is always available for virtual speaking engagement. And people, put a price tag on it, please. We need Becky to go full time into speaking because you hear it here that she is phenomenal and her voice needs to be heard across multiple platforms. Becky, I just want to thank you for, quite frankly, your openness, because as someone without a disability, I too always feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I never want to offend, and then I'm overcompensating and just being weird, to be honest. You know what I mean? So thank you again for speaking with us and taking the time.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.